So hi, everybody. Hi. Hi, moro. Suomi mainittu. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here at the very, very first React Finland conference keynoting this. I haven't lived in Finland for a while, but when I last lived here in 2014, there was no React community. There was barely a React. It was something that was very recently open sourced at the time. And now seeing all you here, all the familiar faces, but also so many of the new faces in this community, it's fantastic, and I feel humbled to be here. So please give yourself an applause. Just, come on, go on. Cool. So if we haven't met before, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Jani. I work at a company called Formidable out of London. Formidable is a consultancy, kind of like all the great consultants you have here, Futures, Reactor, whatever. But what we do is just JavaScript. And we have a very humble, small mission of being the best damn JavaScript team out there. And as part of that, I've had the privilege to travel to a lot of conferences, participate in a lot of conversations, online and offline, with the people who actually make React and make all the tools that we use on a daily basis. And if you want to participate in these conversations, Twitter is a great place to do it. You can follow me there. If you like shitposting, it's a good idea. If you don't like shitposting, then don't follow me. But in these conversations, there's one theme that emerges, which is that those of us that work with React think that React is possibly the best way to build user interfaces today. And obviously, there's a bit of a sampling problem in that, this is the React community. If you go to Angular conference and you ask them the same question, they probably won't tell you that React is the best way of doing it. But for the purpose of this, this group, I think this is an opinion that many of us share. And if you don't, hopefully today, these 2 days will convince you of it. But one of the things that we believe is that not only that React is an OK library to create web frontends, but it's a fundamentally and conceptually a great tool. And 5 years into React's lifetime, what I want to talk about is why are there still so many reasons to be excited to be part of this community and working with these great tools. And what I want to do is just inspire you about some of the things and then get to talking about some best practices. What I want you to take from this, if you haven't done a lot of React or you're just starting on your journey, hopefully I will be able to actually teach you something. If you're a more senior React engineer, hopefully I'll be able to kind of affirm some of the fundamentals and concepts and ideas that you already know and help you kind of critically evaluate your own work. And if you're one of the small minority of people, but influential minority of people who are the so-called thought leaders, the library authors, the framework builders in our industry, I hope that I can challenge you to think about building software in a different way. So when React was introduced, we didn't all think that it was great. In fact, everyone pretty much fucking hated it. From day one, 2013, everybody thought this was a terrible idea. And one of the reasons is that some of the design decisions in React really just flew in the face of everything that we believe to be true about web development. There were so many assumptions that we had around how do you split our concerns, separating logic and templates, all these kinds of ideas. And I think this tweet, and I'm not picking on this guy, but Ben Allman, who is the creator of Grunt and many other things, I think this snarky evergreen tweet is a good example of it. React questioned the best practices of its time. How dare they? How dare they look at all this crap that we're doing and think it's not good? The audacity of it. But the thing about best practices, which is what my talk is about, is that they're useful rules of thumb. They can communicate simple ideas, but they're not great for nuance. Putting big ideas, complex ideas in a pithy small sentence is a good way of losing context of where the idea came to begin with. And the ideas are supposed to be educational and actionable, but they're not supposed to be restrictive. They're not supposed to kind of constrain our thinking. So I think it's OK for you to look around and recognize if something is not working for you. It's probably not a good idea to double down on those assumptions. If web development at that time was a garbage fire, then why should we continue keeping those ideas alive? So I'm sorry to say this, but if your main motivation is to upkeep existing status quo, you're a fucking cop, and we don't like cops, right? The problem is that these best practices constrain innovation. They state these rules, they state these boundaries, and they tell you to stay in that box. That's where you're allowed to think, that's where you're allowed to act, and that's where you're allowed to operate. But the fact of the matter is that no matter how much you try to write and enforce these laws, to sustain the current regime, to keep people in check, revolutions are inevitable. Revolution is something that's always going to happen, because change is going to happen. And React or something like this was always going to be an inevitable outcome, because at the time we had real problems that just weren't being addressed. I was working on code bases, and no matter how hard I tried, and my colleagues tried, and much smarter people than I tried, they just couldn't keep them in check. And React kind of picked up on this wave of mainstream functional programming, light, that was really coming to the fore at the time. It had it solved for the constraints of its environment, which was the web browser, and it had a great API and really clever implementation. And in the world of technology, or well, maybe in the world at large, when technology is driving so much of our world today, where the change comes from is innovation. Because no matter what rules you write, people simply won't stop innovating. They won't stop seeing problems that exist and trying to solve them. And they won't stop looking at the constraints in which the people exist and suddenly stop trying to break out of those constraints. And revolutions in technology are always going to be inevitable, because revolution is part of innovation. Every now and then, this big idea will come along. It's going to boost us forward very quickly, very fast, because the innovation itself is so grand that it's going to destroy existing paradigms. And this is OK. If you think about the invention of the car, whatever we had before, there's a saying, faster horses, all that stuff. I'm sure that you all heard this thing before. But the invention of the car was such an undeniable innovation that, yes, it broke a lot of things. It forced us to kind of rethink things like infrastructure. We needed to build roads. We needed to figure out how to make them safe. But it was an innovation that we had to have. And then innovation is followed by the second era of refinement. That is slower, a lot more boring, but it's necessary in order to make the things actually function well. And this is where we are right now in React. We've gone through the big explosion of innovation, breaking all the norms, and we're starting to norm the way we work again. React as a library is being improved every year. We figure out how to do things like state management better. But these are going to be marginal improvements compared to the massive jump. And eventually, those gains will cap out and flatline. And the only way for us to move forward will be another revolution, right? We'll need to make another jump. Because even if React is the best tool for us today, we won't be using it forever. And maybe this is not the message you want to hear at the keynote of the React conference. But how do we know that? It's because all we have to do is look in the past and see that nothing lasts forever, right? But every innovation is built on the shoulders of giants, and we don't start from scratch. When the first car was built, they borrowed from the best designs of horse carriages. When Elon Musk is building the first electric car, he doesn't need to figure out how to build an aerodynamic body and lighter materials. All they need to do is build a better engine, but they can use all that stuff that we've come up in the middle. But what I've also tried to illustrate in this diagram is that every new cycle begins a bit lower. It is very scientific, by the way, but every new cycle begins with a bit lower than the previous one. And it's because when you invent something new, you also need to throw away some of those efficiency gains that you've had before. If you've optimized your combustion engine, the first electrical engine is not going to be as effective. It's going to take you another decade to make it good. Because when you maximize the value, what you get out of an old methodology, you reach this local maxima and you can't push upwards. And the cost of innovation is that in order to adopt a new methodology to get higher, you need to take a temporary slump in productivity. In programming, this looks like when you adopt React, you need to throw away your entire jQuery component library or what have you. Or when you start learning a new tool, new methodology, all those productivity tricks, all those kind of institutional knowledge that you built needs to be thrown away. And this is pretty much what happened during the so-called framework wars. I don't know if anybody remembers this era a few years ago when being a web developer is a super weird experience. Every 6 months, you were rewriting everything from scratch. Because new solutions came about. They promised to solve something. We were so desperate for solutions, we accepted them. And then we found out that, holy shit, the new thing isn't actually any better. Or it's better in some ways, but it's worse in others. And for every step forward, we need to take basically half a step back. And this is where the whole JavaScript fatigue thing comes in. Because we're not able to build stable software, because every time you hit a roadblock, you need to throw away everything and start anew, right? But recently, I feel that the ecosystem has stabilized a lot. Right now, I believe that we live in an unprecedented era of peace and prosperity and productivity in our front-end development lives. Just like the real war ends, nobody wins. Like there's not like one country that then spans the entire world. But we've drawn some borders. There's a whole lot of options for us to choose from. You can use React or Vue or Ember or Angular 5 or whatever it is now, Cycle.js, other languages, ClojureScript, Elm. And there's still JavaScript fatigue in that you need to make a choice between these things, but at least we have good tools. And I think now would be a good time to take a breather and take a longer view on what we're actually trying to do and what we're trying to achieve and how we're going to get there. So if the goal for technology is not to be, exist for technology's sake, it's to build products, maybe this is a good time to, focus less on tools and focus more on product. But again, because innovation is not going to stop, there's smart people out there who want to solve problems that they have. We need to figure out a way to do it sustainably. And I predict in this long view, React will be around for a long time. I predict that React will be around for longer than any of the other things that I just mentioned. And really quickly, I want to tell you why before we get to the best practices. So I think React will be around because of components. And you think, components? Like, everybody's got components. What's so special about components? React's components differ from any other component model in that it implements a singular primitive that you can do almost anything with. They're arbitrarily composable, so it has a clean interface in which you have your inputs and you have your outputs, and you have like mechanisms where we can do metaprogramming so we can actually combine things. And because they're functional, they're also inherently reliable, they're hard to break. And it means that we can essentially have like a single API and build anything on it. And this to me is absolutely crazy. Is that if you look at components, they're not only a primitive for productivity or composability or any of those technical things. What they are a primitive for is innovation. They're primitive for something, it's a platform that we can actually build on. Because the React API itself hasn't changed that much. Sure, we've gone from create class to components, or like class components. We've improved the context. We moved the prop types out of the package. This is like small things. But it's the community itself. It's you people who are essentially like pushing us forward. If you think of the kind of like the big movers and shakers right now in the React community, things like the whole state management debacle, Redux, Mobex, like the fact that we've had this free discourse of ideas, the fact that anybody has been able to contribute to this conversation, not only by choosing what they use in their own product in order to make that better, but also create their own solutions in a way that doesn't disrupt the existing world. That's amazing. Sarah will be talking about Apollo. Apollo is a GraphQL client. It's fantastic. The fact that I have an existing app that I can use that has an existing code base, and I can integrate an entirely new data networking architecture in it just by wrapping my existing component with a new Apollo higher-order component, that to me just blows my mind. Or Kasia will be talking about styled components in context of server-side rendering. I mean, styled component is one of those things that has like made us so much more productive, and it's something that came from completely outside the React core community, but we can use it without having any disruption to our existing workflows. And it's because React today continues to exist and be popular. It hasn't yet been replaced in these last 5 years in the same way we used to replace everything, is that it doesn't lock itself down and force new innovators to work outside the castle walls, but it continues to benefit from everybody here who is working on making it better. What I find really exciting about React and why I think it has longevity is also the fact that this programming model is not constrained just to web browsers. React Native is a great example. That's what I work on most of the day these days. It's fantastic. We have in the pipeline, we have renders for VR, AR. I've even heard some rumors about Facebook working on React for Unity. Leland Richardson, who works on the Android team at Google, recently released an experimental library called Recoil that allows you to write React apps in Swift and in Kotlin for iOS and Android or for native platforms. The fact that we have this kind of single programming model, this single kind of existing knowledge base, and we can use that is amazing. But what's even more amazing is that when we bring all these other people into the conversation and we start to listen to their ideas and start solving for their constraints, what we're going to do is that we're going to create a truly universal programming model that will actually, hopefully, stand the test of time. Ken and a bunch of other people will be talking about ReasonML. Very exciting development. If you don't like JavaScript, but you want to target the web platform, target the native platform, we have options. I don't know if you've heard of React Sketch app. It's a tool that you can take your React components and render them into Sketch, which brings designers into the conversation, that we can start actually working more effectively in React code bases with our designers. This to me is revolutionary in an entirely different way. And finally, before the best practices, I think the great thing about React, and one of the things about longevity, is that there's actually space to innovate. It's because it's not a one-stop shop. Nobody played God and decided that this is how you should build your apps. What it does is it gives you a platform, with all those things like composability. It gives you a platform to actually build things, but it leaves you space to innovate. And with this functional programming paradigm, a lot of smart people are interested in it, and they come to React. And what do smart people want to do? They want to solve hard problems and prove everybody how smart they are. So they're going to go ahead and create libraries. They're going to keep continuing to make the ecosystem better. And because React itself is flexible enough to actually use this instead of break under this change, we all benefit. But now, what about them best practices? Somebody told me I was going to hear best practices today. Give me those best practices. Let me ask you a question. Do we need best practices? What even is a best practice? Look at what happened to our old best practices. Why would I tell you here that separate your presentational components from your container components? Because exactly the same thing as separate your models from your views and from your views your controllers. It's the exact same thing, right? What point is there to make best practices that are not going to stand the test of time? If you want these best practices, they're already out there. There's great materials where people have written blog posts where they tell you to use render props instead of hawks, or hawks instead of render props, or functional children is a thing, or they will tell you these things, and you can follow them, and you can take them to heart, and you can critically analyze them, and hopefully they will provide you some value. But the next time you go over a change, those best practices will be thrown out, and the best practice cops will try to point at what you're doing and go, no, don't do that because that's not the best practice. And we don't even need to wait until the big jump, the big revolution for this to happen to invalidate everything that we believe. One of the key tenets of React today is that components are supposed to be pure, right? Render method is pure. You just return some JSX. You don't cause any side effects. But what about suspense? Can I get a show of hands who here does not know what suspense is? OK, cool. We have a few people. So React has always discussed this idea of asynchronous rendering. It's something that a lot of groundwork needed to happen for asynchronous rendering. The entire internals of React needed to be rewritten with the new algorithm that is called Fiverr. But asynchronous rendering is going to be a solution to a lot of the performance problems and the scheduling problems that React applications face today. The runtimes, no matter how good they are, how good they're getting, but they will always have bottlenecks in which the synchronous single-thread model execution will fail. And this is what asynchronous rendering solves. The feature is implemented for now with something in marketing speak called suspense. And the suspense is essentially a promise that you throw from your render method, and when that promise is executed, evaluated, it can execute side effects, which means that the render method in no way or shape or form will be pure. Do we think that that best practice, that your render method must be pure, is still something that we should keep saying, or must we keep saying, yes, keep your render method pure, except for promises that you throw that are then eventually scheduled by the by the async renderer, right? Like these best practices get increasingly convoluted, and they don't actually serve any purpose. And this goes back to best practices being absolute statements that lack nuance, and that's what it makes it a blunt instrument. What we actually need is best practices for writing code that is resilient to disruption. And what I mean by this is not that the best practices themselves need to be resilient. They should be strong opinions that we loosely hold, but we need best practices for writing code that will be resilient to disruption, the code itself. It's also not saying that we want to be cops and uphold the status quo and stop revolutions. What we want is a stable platform on which we can continue to write software productively, that we can continue focusing on products instead of rewriting existing code just for the heck of it. And we want to do this in a way that doesn't constrain innovation, doesn't constrain new ideas. We don't want to stagnate just in order to protect what we have. And if we can create an ecosystem in which the brightest minds, many of you here, Finland is, like I've known so many people, every time I go to the internet and I see some, cool FP library, there's like a fairly good chance, statistically speaking, that it's going to come from Finland. So all of you people are, working on like amazing things, and we want to, like work together. We want to be a big, massive distributed team that can create basically a better future for us. So what we actually want is we want to continue in peace and prosperity instead of having to pay the unbearable cost of war and starting from scratch. So finally, we get to the title. I worked really, really hard to actually retrofit this talk into this title. I know if you notice how hard I'm working, but I decided that I'm going to try anyway. So let's see what happens. I hope that you'll be able to leverage these when you think about your own code. So you don't need to be a library builder. You don't need to be a somebody who is building React itself or thinking about things on a grander level. If you are a more junior programmer, or if you're somebody who has a lot of experience but is just moving to React, I hope that these things will be valuable to you in your own work. But also all these front row nerds here, all these other speakers and all the other library authors and people who are working inside companies to define the ways of the future. I would really like for you to listen to this and just evaluate the things that you're doing and see if this is something that maps to it, because I think this thing is important. Well, to begin with, it's a universal fact that large things are hard to build, impossible to maintain, but most importantly, they break when any part is removed. If you take a monolithic approach, like, for example, Angular 1 did, where they fail is that when new innovation comes available, you want to use it, but you can't because you've essentially programmed yourself into a corner. And this leads to things like extinction events. Angular 1 no longer being maintainable, needed to move on, and much misery and heartbreak and lost productivity was caused for all of us. So rule number 1, build big things from small things. And when you're writing code to be consumed by others, follow the inverse of this principle, which is do one thing and do it well. And React itself abides by this principle. All the React code that you write abides by this principle. But you can look at this from a grander scheme and see, are the things that you are doing, the choices you are making, actually following this? Are you overreaching? Are you going to be flexible for the future? Secondarily, I think it's important to consider who is actually the intended audience of your code. It's important that your code runs performantly on the compiler and the VM, but I think it's much more important that your code can actually be read by other humans. Because that way it can be modified, it can be extended, it can be maintained, and it can be replaced when people understand what it actually does. So give things meaningful names. For God's sake, it's 2018, use Flow, use TypeScript, use Reason, because types are the best way of documenting how things actually fucking work. There is absolutely no reason for you not to do this, and if you're not doing this, I will want to have a conversation with you later, because this is not okay, people. Use things like Storybook to document the usage of your components, to catalog them. Take time to define well-thought-out APIs, no matter how hard it is, because the first idea will always not be the best idea. So take time when you write code that will be used by others to make sure that it actually makes sense. So that's rule number 2. Write code for humans first. One of the critical mistakes that A lot of these traditional template-based frameworks like Angular have made, but also a mistake that I believe is currently being made today by libraries like Vue, is that you create new abstractions entirely unnecessarily instead of just using JavaScript or using your language. It's very hard for existing tools like linters or formatters to work with them. It's very hard to integrate third-party code with them because everything is custom and there's no clean interface to do so. So in order to solve this, all these libraries have to create enormous amounts of tooling, and what that tooling is, it becomes dead, it becomes burden, it becomes something that actually weighs you down and keeps you from moving fast instead of enabling you to take advantage of the next thing. And what React is able to do is every time a new JavaScript language feature comes in, you can use it because it's just JavaScript, right? So yeah, utilize primitives like functions, objects. Think of data as data and transformations as functions. Don't try to build like things that aren't actually part of the language. And if you don't like JavaScript, that's okay. You can use Reason. It's a great language, has a lot of features that you can take advantage of it. Rule number 4, and this probably should have been number 1, is always, always, always prefer the simple solution over the complicated one. Like I don't know how much I can say about this. Like people should know this, but at the same time, empirical evidence shows that people don't know this. Because we're also fucking clever, and we love our little clever solutions. That we think that our clever solution is going to be so much better than the other simple thing that exists out there, but it's not. Like it's really not. So just keep things simple. If you spend a lot of effort paring down your API, React is great because it's simple. It's a single API, components with props and context in, and 0 or 1 or many React elements out. Like that simplicity and that pays off. But it probably took a lot of way to get there. If you look at some of the early React design conversations or documents that have surfaced on the web, there was a lot more crap in there that took a lot of work to pare down. Rule number 5. Don't break things. We know that React API has stayed stable, but it has also changed. And what we can learn from companies like Facebook is A, have unlimited money. That's useful. But even in your lives, you don't actually need all those resources to follow these principles. What Facebook is doing is that every time they make a change, they do it responsively. They deprecate things well in advance. They communicate it well, and when the things finally change, they release an automated way for you to do that, using something like code mods. So utilize tools like JS CodeShift. Think about your consumers of your code, whether it's an open source library or an API that you create internally in your company, not as something that exists as discrete versions of 1, 2, and 3, but is like a fluid path that people will need to able to move through. Because every time you make a barrier for somebody to move on, it causes them distress, but also it causes the possibility of you losing that particular audience or that particular user, and it causes unnecessarily people to iterate unnecessarily. So yeah, don't stagnate. Keep changing, but don't also break things. But the final and hardest rule, and the thing about rules is that there's always going to be contradictions. Is to keep an open mind about what is it that we're doing and you're doing in your work. Because sooner or later in this life cycle of React, we will eventually get to a point where the returns will become diminishing. The efficiency requirements, the phase that we are currently in, will run out and the progress will halt. I'm not trying to predict the future. I'm not saying when it happens or what React will look like at that time, but this will happen. We will, sooner or later, not be able to have meaningful improvements year on year on the ways we work. And maybe that's fine. Maybe the place where we end up is going to be the perfect place. It's going to be the nirvana. It's going to be the amazing, perfection that nobody even needs to think about any other place, just like the Soviet Union. But I highly doubt it. I highly doubt that we are going to actually get there. Because sooner or later, some smart whiz kid, some annoying little brat that's 20 years younger than you, is going to come up with some idea. It might be one of you who's going to come up with that idea. And then you're going to go, oh my Jesus fucking Christ. I don't want to. I was so happy. But you need to listen to those ideas, because your first reaction will be to reject it outright. And that's the thing about best practices being cops, is that cops fucking suck. Revolution will happen, and you need to you need to be able to keep an open mind to this. For sure, we need to critically evaluate their statements and not chase things for the sake of change. So hypothetically, if somebody were to release a frameworkless JavaScript framework that you can write components, but there's no framework, it just generates the code for you. If somebody were to release something like this, I would say, cool, but does it actually work? That was, if anybody got that reference, then cool. If you didn't, then I don't want to smack talk him because he has more Twitter followers than I do. For the time being, I'm happy to be focusing on products and not necessarily on the technology itself. But there are plenty of constraints to solve. React has solved many of them. It solves maintainability, composability. The performance is getting pretty good, but there are still constraints to solve. And one of that, that hypothetical framework that doesn't come with a framework is like, can we actually make things distributable in a way that don't require a runtime? In the age of WebAssembly, is there a possibility for a framework that can actually run on just like purely generated, optimized code without having any weight to it? So eventually an idea will come along. I'm not saying it's that. And we need to be ready to accept the facts and adapt to it. I like to always quote this tweet. I think it's a very nice, insightful aphorism by Guillermo Rauch, who is creator of Next.js and other things, is that React is such a good idea that we'll spend the rest of the decade continuing to explore its implications and applications. And to me, this is still true. 5 years ago, it was impossible to imagine that we'd be still using the same tools in 5 years. And I don't know what the next level thing is, but I wouldn't be surprised if in 5 years we'd be using React. And it's because it's all of you, all the smart people here, all the amazing speakers that we're going to have that are talking about original work, original research that they're doing in order to make the ecosystem better. And all the people who aren't speaking here, all the people who are in the audience watching, I bet you have a lot of really great ideas to contribute to this conversation. So I hope to have many of those with you today. And I hope even you're Finnish, and small talk is hard, but approach people, whether it's speakers or each other in the audience, and just talk and share ideas, because that's where we are just best. And I'm still 5 years in, so fucking excited to be part of this community. Thank you.